All right, welcome to The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll be your co-hosts as we explore topics related to the end of the world through the lens of media, particularly films, literature, and television programs, with also occasional sidelines into historical examples of apocalyptic or near-apocalyptic or apocalyptic-seeming events.
Right, and I think we'll also touch on, when there are, related news items that come up as we approach the looming end of the world. We'll cover those as well.
Yeah, as they arise. At the beginning of the show, we'll probably spend a few minutes discussing any relevant doomsday events on the horizon before jumping for the rest of the episode into a consideration of whatever the pre-assigned topic for the week is. What drew you to want to talk about this topic, Michael?
Well, I mean, a few things. I think the first thing is that there's been this real sort of proliferation of this content. I don't know, over the last decade or two. It feels like it's moved squarely into both the mainstream and even sort of like higher brow television, literature, and film. What used to sort of be, apocalyptic content was sort of, whether it was nerdy or niche, right, fantastical,
Yeah.
has sort of become realistic and grimy, and it sort of, I think, speaks to the overall dystopian view that we all, or many of us, actually now carry around with us every day.
Yeah, so this topic, which was once sort of on the periphery in horror films, science fiction, epics, things of that nature, has now become the territory of like prestige television and legitimately considered artistic films, as opposed to sort of this schlockier kind of grindhouse sort of
right
history of the genre. Yeah, I think that's relevant, and I think the reasons for this are, quite obvious. On the one hand, the rise of climate change, the seeming disintegration of institutions that once seemed reliable, particularly in the American context, but I think that's also something that's happening more globally as well. The center doesn't hold, to borrow a phrase from
yeah
Yeats.
and I think too, there is the element of our conception of what is going to transpire. I'm sort of fascinated by this feeling that I don't know if this has existed at any other point in history, where most or many people, at least, sort of go around with the underlying notion that in their lifetime, or at least in the lifetime of their children, there's going to be some sort of catastrophic meltdown of institutions, of the very workings of society. And it's interesting, I think, to start to look at how fiction, or in some cases nonfiction, how we approach that, how we conceive of it, and what the limitations of our conceptions are.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think in the past there certainly were, there have been doomsday cults for centuries, if not millennia, right? People who were of the strong, firm belief the world would end, imminently. But as you say, I think those people were previously very much on the periphery, where now it feels like, even just in sort of mainstream society, it's not so crazy to think about the potential for cataclysm.
Right. There's like that sort of slightly banal notion, right, that life is becoming a Black Mirror episode,
Right,
and that
right.
maybe like Black Mirror stopped hitting so hard as the world we live in seemed to converge on the sort of dark dystopian nightmare that it was portraying when it first
Right.
came onto the scene.
Black Mirror is no longer powerful because life has kind of caught up to Black Mirror, right? Like
Yeah,
art is
exactly.
imitating life is imitating art, and now, they're too similar. It's hard to discern where the one ends and the other begins in a way. So for our first episode, we're taking a little bit of an unconventional choice. We're talking about the 2016 film directed by Denis Villeneuve, Arrival. And what was it that you were the one to suggest this, Michael? What is about Arrival that you think is a useful entry point for our conversations?
there are a couple things. The first is that it's a little more grounded than your typical alien invasion movie,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
At least it sort of claims to be, right? And so
It's the
what
thinking man's alien movie.
yes, this is no Mars Attacks, right?
Yeah.
This is an actual, I think, imagination of how things might actually unfold if this type of alien contact was made. And at the same time, I think what is sort of very much in tune with the overall idea of the podcast is, as we'll talk about, the sort of the seeming limitations of the writer and the movie when it comes to act like processing the premise and moving through how both the protagonist and society at large like reacts, to what's happening. And I think that speaks to our idea of part of the struggle with coping with the seeming end times that we exist in, is a real imagination gap, both socially, politically, economically, or what have you.
Yeah, so the film in some ways is not fully able to process the like reality or the implications of what such a
Right. And what's interesting about this
and
one
the,
is that it kind of thinks it is
yeah, yeah,
doing.
and those limitations or those inabilities to process are themselves revelatory, right? They show us something about the kind of limits of apocalyptic thinking, the limits of our
Right.
imagination, and yeah, yeah. So the film is really interesting. It centers on a character portrayed by Amy Adams, who's great in the movie, and I'm a big fan of her work overall. But it's a little bit of an odd entry point into the apocalypse, right? We open up with the aliens have arrived. The arrival sort of has already happened, right? And Amy Adams is a linguist. She's a teacher. She teaches a class at a university that's on sort of the history of language, the interrelationships of languages, the language trees, various hypotheses that have developed over time about what the nature of the way we speak tells us about how we see the world, things like this. But she gets to class and there's like 5 students. Presumably it's in a giant lecture hall. Presumably it's a class that has like hundreds of people. And
Yeah.
as we see her walking in, there are people crowded around TVs.
Right. Like she already hasn't heard, which
Yeah.
is a little bit of a leap because one would assume that if a group of people are sort of huddled around a television, which by the way is just like randomly on
in the
the news
in the
in the
of
middle of this
the
student
university.
center,
Yeah, yeah.
that no one has sort of like tapped her on the shoulder and been like, it appears as though aliens have arrived.
Right.
So
Did
she
you
makes
hear
it,
the
makes it,
news?
yeah. So she makes it all the way into the class, which is the first,
That's
bit
sort
of a
of
stretch. But
oddity. Yeah.
right, but again, it's 2016. It's not quite the like omnipotence of social media. Maybe
I
there's a
mean,
chance,
social media was very present in our lives in 2016, but it has become
but
much
not
more,
for
much
maybe
more
not for
so.
maybe not for a linguist professor who clearly like
Who's in her
keeps to
30s
herself.
or 40s or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and is like sort of dealing.
TikTok did not yet exist, so
And she's very removed and with reason. Like she's processing. It appears at the beginning of the movie she's like processing the loss of a child. We're not sure
there are
how recent that
flashbacks
is.
in the beginning that that indicate to us part of the reason she's not maybe so up on the news is that she's overcome with recovering the aftermath of some kind of tragedy. We see a daughter who's
Right.
ill. We see her growing up. We see her in a hospital. It seems that the daughter has passed away. And
Right.
that is, I think, understandable, right? The idea.
Yeah, and I think that's used to suggest that she has these blinders on, but it starts to get to the point a little incredulity, right? When she comes in and again there's 5 kids there and she just sort of starts in
She's
on
like,
her lecture.
what's the history of Romance languages or like whatever?
Yeah, she starts speaking about Portuguese, right?
Right. And the
And then you hear these like a couple cell phones going off, right?
and then one of the students is
finally,
like, "Can you turn on the news?" And she's like,
can you turn on the news channel? Which is a great line. I love that.
Yeah. Just because there's just a TV that gets television channels
Cable.
in
It does appear as much.
as the classrooms are wired. I'm a teacher by trade, and I have yet to have a classroom that is fully wired for cable. One can dream. But yeah, so they learned that these objects have appeared around the world. I think initially they say there are 8 objects. They're 1,500 feet tall, and they've appeared at seemingly random places around the world. I think eventually it's expanded that there are in fact 12 objects, right? That they appear to be alien ships of some kind.
Right, and they're hovering, and they're not giving any information.
They're not doing anything.
They're not explaining themselves.
Right. They're just there. And
which I think is important to point out, because it is one of the things that differentiates from, other classic attack-based
War of the
alien
Worlds
invasions.
or things of that
Independence Day.
Yeah.
Where like the idea is that any potentiality sort of looms over the arrival. They could be aggressive. They could be peaceful. They could be seeking something. They could be ready to harvest our organs for energy.
They could steal our minerals or resources. We don't know.
Right. And that sort of goes to my first point, is that we don't know anything, and that's purposeful. But our protagonist, for all intents and purposes, she ends her class early. She's willing to do that. And everybody's sort of strolling out of the class, and you're sort of seeing these weird kind of sporadic signs of urgency. A car runs into another car in the parking lot for some reason.
Right. There's military jets are heard flying over.
Yeah.
People are reacting, but not very quickly, right?
She goes back home. Right. She just gets a glass of red and sits and watches the news.
Then that's how amazingly, the next day, she goes back to work.
She goes right back to work, despite starting to get some information.
Yeah.
Right. The first thing she listens to is this press secretary type who is, delivering a very quotidian sounding, sort of press read.
Almost as if there's been a tragic earthquake in California. FEMA
that's right.
Is on the scene or whatever.
Right. There's been an air crash, and obviously we're doing an independent investigation.
Yeah.
And there's that great line where the press secretary tries to assure everybody to not panic. Right?
Because we have protocols in place.
We have protocols, which is absolutely hysterical to think of, right?
Like being in on the planning mission. So what do we do when the 12 alien objects land and are not interacting with us?
Right, and it really does it does sort of draw a immediate comparison, I think, for us in the real world to our experience of 9/11.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think. Yeah, we're both old enough that we've lived through disasters. Recently COVID's a little different, sort of a slow-moving disaster. 9/11 is the obvious point of reference for.
I think that's right.
Pseudo-apocalyptic event.
But of course, what's amazing to consider is that their whole defense of their lack of preparedness for 9/11 was exactly the lack of protocol and imagination.
The protocols.
We just couldn't even have imagined planes running into the World Trade Center. This was a bridge too far, but apparently they've got protocols for when 12 alien vessels hover at seemingly random places around the world, But it did make me think about our experience in 9/11, because while I was rewatching it recently, the first inclination is to kind of ridicule how she reacted. Right.
Because she's incredibly passive. She has she's almost flat affect in the face of this.
Despite the fact that as we get into the movie, her single biggest, to her credit, character trait is her intuition.
Yeah.
Her gut, But apparently she's not ready to turn on the intuition.
Yeah, she's just
for now,
she's in airplane mode or whatever.
That's right. For now, it's just Merlot and just get the facts, But, I think about, and I know everyone has a 9/11 story, but I think mine really speaks to the possibility that for all the flaws in the movie that I find later on, that maybe this wasn't so far away
Yeah.
from how some people would react. I remember I was a senior in high school when this was happening, and I was growing up in suburban Ontario, like an hour outside Toronto. And uh, we would have these when you were a senior, you could take spare periods, and the spare periods would alternate between the first period and the last one, which means some students wouldn't arrive until homeroom, which was, right around the time of this attack taking place.
Yeah.
And the way that the class I was in was actually U.S. history, and the
Perfect.
way that our teacher, yeah, it's just amazing. The way that it would start every day is our teacher, Mr. Wilson, he would do current events, and he would try to engage the kids by getting them to talk about something. And sometimes it was about history, or, current actual political events or what have you. But sometimes it was just like a kid would explain that the field hockey team won,
Sure,
so it was
sure.
very low stakes. It was just to get some engagement going with these kids in the morning. And this kid is in our class. His name's Adam, and he was really sweet kid, really introverted, very quiet. And he sat at the back, and he rarely offered up information. And the class starts, and people do start just saying random things from the previous day. Um, when he's sort of in the back holding his hand up very shyly,
Uh-huh.
and three or four people have done their routine thing, contributing.
Michael
And he
Jordan
put,
is ending his retirement for this.
yeah, exactly. Right. And so the teacher calls on Adam finally, and he very sheepishly and confusedly, which I think is fair, he says, well, they say it could be an accident, but right before I came to class, a plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And, obviously the teacher, I still remember, like, the expression on his face was like half like, some kids might try to fuck with me, but not Adam,
Yeah.
So like, he wouldn't do this, but like, what the hell are you talking about? Ironically, it's like, it was quite true that he could not have even imagined, right, the possibility of a plane doing this. And so he asks again, he's like, what? Sorry, what are you talking about?
So he kind of can't process.
He can't process the information. And
Yeah.
he's like, what are you talking about? And Adam says, yeah, a plane ran into the World Trade Center. They think it might be an accident. But then right before I left my house, a second plane ran into the second building.
So sort of like starts to lean against accident, right? Like,
yeah. And like, at this point, the teacher's fully like, mouth open, like can't entertain this as real, but can't like ignore it either. And I immediately get up with my friend Dan to leave, because obviously two planes have crashed into the World Trade Center, and this is sort of like,
you don't need history class, you're living history class.
It's like it's really unfolding in real time. And I get up, and the teacher's like, where do you think you're going? I'm like, I'm gonna go home to watch the news, and I turned to Adam, and I just was like, you're telling me that two planes crashed into the World Trade Center, and your first thought was, I better get to homeroom? And like, so then when I rewatched Arrival, it was like, oh yeah, like I think people, I mean, I don't think I would. I mean, I reacted the way I react to everything. I fucking panicked. I thought a nuclear war. I thought there'd be a nuclear war by the end of the week. I was like, holy shit. And but again, like, I'm running out of the school, and at this point, people are figuring it out. And the principal comes on the PA.
The PA, yeah.
And he like announces to the school, there's truth to the rumors that America has been attacked, and we're getting all the information we can. I want to assure students of Southwood Secondary School that our place of education is not a target. which like, I guess it's something you say, but like, the idea that Al Qaeda has this list that is like,
they're like, all right, well, that's Ontario public school. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then that, watching Arrival back, it's like, oh yeah, okay. There probably would be people who can't process or don't want to.
I think that's very true. And so, all right. One thing that's interesting about this is that almost immediately, I think the second day after she goes back to work.
Well, this is where we get into the ridiculous section.
Where the military appears. Like,
yeah, well, I mean, no, but for the second day, she goes back to work. I mean, I'm sorry,
yeah.
but like, surely by then, she knows that there's not going to be class. It's like not even a questionable snow day, right? Like this is a huge fucking moment, and like the school wouldn't be open; it would be locked. The classroom would be locked. Like, how any of this? She comes back in with the textbook that she's ready to read off of again. And then
she's like, all right, so yesterday was pretty exciting, guys, but like time to get back to work.
Yeah. And guess what? This time there's no one in the class.
Yeah.
So she goes to her office, and I guess she's still got office hours, maybe, in case anyone's
she's working on her tenure file. She's got to add some.
But this is the first moment. This is the first moment of the movie that really pops out at me, and it's a little bit out of left field, but we see her watching a stream on her laptop of a newscast.
Yeah.
Right? That is explaining the current state of affairs. And my first thought when I was rewatching it was like, how do you dare to open the laptop? You see what I'm saying?
Right.
How could you dare? Because like this is the overriding problem I have with the movie is that like nobody's considering what might be possible. The truly impossible has happened.
Right.
But then apparently, like, who knows what control the aliens have over our information system? Who knows that maybe if you open the laptop, like I'm scared enough, to get one of those like malwares that tell you they like caught, they've got you on your webcam jerking off. And if you don't send $50,000, you're going to send it to your entire friends and family. I'm already worried about that stuff. You're telling me that aliens come.
So if aliens appear, you're not like logging in to Facebook or whatever.
Maybe they could blow up your laptop.
Yeah, that's
you have
true.
no idea what they are capable of. And yet you're just willy-nilly like opening yourself up to sending and receiving data packets? Not a fucking chance in hell am I doing that.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. But we also learned some information from her stream, which is that the president has declared a state of emergency.
Well, yes.
A full 48 hours after the arrival of these aliens.
Yeah. I think that sort of like also speaks to the way that the movie squarely feels of an earlier time. Like, I think you get a sense. This movie's coming out. It's like 2016. It's being filmed in 2015. It's very much of the pre-Trump.
Yeah, I think the media, like, we could talk about the media now because I think it's one of the themes we both found really hilarious about this film. That, it's a very good-looking movie. It feels contemporary for the most part visually. But the depiction of the media in it still feels very much locked in a kind of cable news, hyper social mediatized environment, as far as pre-fake news, pre the sort of post-Trump. It's pre the post-Trump like environment in which we have lived since 2016,
and with the government too, right? The idea that they have the steady hand to wait 48 hours to figure out if this is an emergency or not.
Right. There's no panic. There's just, let's wait and see. 2 days of the aliens being here. Emergency. Okay. We learn a couple of funny details. Borders are closed. Flights have been grounded.
Yeah. I think for this section, I think what we should really do is just, what happens is she gets to watch a rather extended news clip.
Yeah.
Okay. And what is remarkable about it is how quotidian it is, how similar it is to, you might see a report on bad weather, for example.
Yeah.
Right. So like the text of the movie is after Tuesday's extraordinary events, the president this morning declared a state of emergency with as many as 5,000 National Guards being deployed to the state of Montana alone.
5,000. That should hold them.
Just 5,000. Yeah, that should do. And then it goes on. It's borders are closed and flights have been grounded. Reasonable. Okay.
Fair enough.
That's good to know. Stranding millions of travelers. I love that. Like the idea that
just
they're
like
gonna
people angry trapped in the airport.
Yeah. They cut to like a reporter at like JFK reminding viewers of like their rights as passengers and like when they can get a refund for their flight. They've got like some like uncle talking about how he's trying to get home for his bowling league championship. It's still in that, right? It's still in that world. It's still like as though that's the type of information people would want at this time. And then the next thing it says, which I also love, the newscaster says, panic buying of gas, water, and food continues to escalate.
Yeah.
Which, look, I'm sure that there would be a lot of people getting as many resources as possible,
Yeah.
right? My first problem with that is the word panic. I think it's
Yeah.
totally misplaced because I think that the people who are panicked, like how I feel like I would react, absolute paralysis,
Yeah.
right? I think
People
if
who are
12 alien
people who are
vessels
buying food and stuff, that's actually like
about as reasonable as you can be and
Yeah.
calm. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that you're even willing to wade out into that environment. You know, the second one I love is panic buying. So that second word, buying. You're telling me that like you're waiting on, so now we're waiting online with the aliens hovering.
the self checkout is like
Yeah, oh,
fully
my chip's not working. Oh, if you try to, you're gonna have to insert, maybe swipe. Oh, no one's, I mean, although I guess if you are buying, you're definitely running up shit on credit, right? Because you're never gonna. That's definitely the move. But, there is this element of trying to portray that things are falling apart, but doing it in like the weirdest. Like I don't know who is writing this A block, but like they're totally disconnected from the reality that would present itself, right? Then again, there's a gem. There's a fucking gem. The very next thing, still in the A block of this newscast, the newscaster announces federal authorities have temporarily lifted all caps on overtime for law enforcement. I mean, think about the level of minutia that like implies that people are still interested in. Like the idea that there are people, they're huddled at home, they've come back with some gas, some water and food. They're going to hunker down. They turn on the TV. Thankfully, it's still working, by the way.
right.
Aliens have apparently not cut off, the cable networks yet. And, you see a husband kind of turn to his family and say, do you think that they're going to keep a cap on overtime for law enforcement? Or do you think they'll lift that so that law enforcement can work overtime in this trying moment? And then the wife is like, don't worry. From what I've heard, it is a temporary lifting of the cap. So like how is that possibly a concern? So then it goes on and it does hit on something I think is actually pretty important.
Yeah.
Says the ATF has put a temporary ban on new gun licenses.
Oh, well,
now,
finally.
We have now fully entered the
there's
realm
like
of fantasy.
300 mass shootings a year and like nothing can be done, but aliens appear and it's like
right.
Stop
Like
this gun thing.
Children being shot, at random in schools couldn't get America to move, but the Second Amendment finally is defeated by aliens arriving.
Right, they haven't even attacked yet or whatever. And also like wouldn't that be the opposite? Like wouldn't it be like
surely I'm as anti-gun as they come. But like this might be an occasion where I'm at least standing beside a guy
with a shotgun or whatever.
Yeah, like I just like, but it's also like a reasonable time to have a fairly well-armed militia, I would think. Not that it could, although I guess like it also wouldn't do anything. The idea of like
you're shooting like the alien or what? Like,
yeah, just like shooting blindly at the vessel, right?
Yeah, that could be bad.
So then it goes on to say that this ban of guns, and again, this is still in the A block of this newscast during this incredible emergency. The newscaster has time to let us know that this move against gun licenses has forced, quote, many independent suppliers of hunting equipment and firearms to close their door to the public, which, I mean, look, if I'm a,
you're a gun shop owner.
It's just like a red-blooded American. Like no matter what happens, they're still appealing to my sensibility about small business owners. Like it's gonna like get me out in the primary. It's like, and again, if I'm an independent,
the hunting shop owners are gonna remember this come election season.
Well, to say nothing of the idea that they're like gonna willingly open their doors to like a fucking panicked public and be like, come in to where I'm surrounded by all of this ammunition and firearms, and maybe I won't fucking die today. I'm gonna like open my shop.
Yeah.
So then it gets to I think what is like our favorite part, right? Which is so in keeping with the humdrum nature of the newscast, even while it's portraying a potentially apocalyptic event. You know how they always talk about the stock market at the end of these sections, right?
They
still do that. They actually still do that.
They say the stock market is down. So shares have fallen 10%. Right?
Right. It's the quote. The quote is the Dow Jones industrial average fell over 2,000 points. And we went and we looked. And at the time of filming, that would represent 11% of the stock market. Okay. And now just for like perspective, Black Monday, 1987, stock market fell 22% because of worries of the strength of the dollar. Okay. So like, which again, like, fine. Okay. You're going to imagine that it only falls 11%. Then that's terrible news writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if I am writing the A block of this newscast and 12 alien vessels
economy
hover,
incredibly resilient,
absolutely resolute in the face of the unknown, the stock market and the humble workaday traders on the floor of the stock exchange said, no, we will continue to move product. It's like, it really is.
I'm not going to panic sell my shares in Exxon or whatever.
This great distillation of, the quote, like, we can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism.
Yes, which is the theme we will come back to.
Right. Like
Frederick Jameson, Mark Fisher. Yes.
Frederick Jameson, Mark Fisher. It's like, even when you are in the world of this pretty well written, pretty subtle, pretty grounded alien invasion movie, we cannot separate from the power of an import of capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's really,
out of my cold dead hand will you take the Dow Jones.
Exactly.
You may take my guns, but never the stock market.
No, exactly. So moving along in the plot, the military approaches her, and she's a linguist, and the aliens are trying to communicate with humans, but so far, no luck. Right. And there's a great scene. This colonel arrives and he just kind of drops a pocket recorder in front of her and starts playing something that's like,
that looks like it's from Radio Shack in 1989.
Yeah. It looks like the kind of thing you have if you're in a band and you want to record your concert from the audience, like that kind of thing. And she goes, "Is that?" And he's like, "No, it's like a clip from the Flintstones movie in the 90s. Like
yeah,
what?
Oh no, yeah, pocket record. Sorry, this is the actual alien.
like what? Yes, it's the aliens he's playing for you, obviously. And she says, "Oh well, I can't do it unless I can be there." And they say, "No way." Out of the question. She's like, "Oh, too bad." And he says, "Well, you translated that Farsi terrorist video for us so effortlessly. What's the difference here?" And it's like, buddy, like, Farsi is like a human language. You can go to a university class and learn to speak it.
Right. And it's almost like he's suspicious that she's withholding her ability from him briefly. Well, it wasn't so hard with the Farsis. And then
he says, "You made such quick work of that Farsi terrorist video." And she says, "And you made such quick work of those terrorists."
Right, which suggests that maybe they're concerned about bringing on what is apparently a full-on communist, right? They're concerned about her politics.
She's part of the woke left. She's anticipating.
But so then what does she do? What is her response?
She says, "Well, if I can't go there, then forget it."
Right. And so they apparently
so she goes home. Like that. Yeah. That's it.
They immediately draw the line, like she wouldn't actually have to be there. It makes no sense at all. Would.
It's ridiculous.
They're gonna zoom her in to talk with the alien because out of security concerns she can't be on the site.
Yeah, and then she goes home, but late at night, what happens? Helicopters. Oh my gosh! Turns out whatever other expert they had,
Danvers,
he wasn't cutting it.
He wasn't cutting it, no.
So they agree to her demands and they take her to the site. And from there we move into the portion of the film in which she's directly engaging with these aliens in an attempt to discern their sort of hieroglyphic-like squid writing, right? Because they appear to be sort of cephalopod aliens. They live in this... There's a viewing room where they can go and see them. Gravity is all awry in their ship. It's very cool. And they appear to be kind of like big octopuses. We also get to meet her helper, played by Jeremy Renner, Ian.
Yeah, her helper, who's like apparently a breathtaking genius of a mathematician who plays precisely no role in the event,
he has
other than to look at her and fall in love and be like, "You are so good at your job."
Yeah. He doesn't contribute anything that we see. Maybe there were cuts. Maybe there was some scene where he triangulates something, uses logarithms to, but that's not in the film. In the film, he is entirely a prop. He's a love interest, and when they're working on figuring out the language, he sort of acts out. He becomes like a mime almost, right?
Yeah. He's walking. And it's like Ian is walking.
Right. Which is one of my favorite scenes in the film. It's quite charming. There's occasional unrest that the film points us towards, right? Like we see that not everywhere in the world is kind of taking this the same way, and in China, initially after the aliens have arrived, it seems like there's collaboration, right? We see scenes where she's kind of video conferencing with scientists in Pakistan. Even the hated enemy of America, China, is sort of collaborating with this effort.
They're sharing their discoveries at first,
and but then along the way we learn that China is ruled in this alternate reality by a sort of totalitarian dictator General Shang, who's great, who rules. I love General Shang, and they're maybe a little more skeptical. We eventually learned that if they've been using mahjong, the classical Chinese tabletop game, which is a sort of zero-sum outcome game, and so there's some worry that maybe the way that they're using this game as the sort of linguistic template, that might lead to an unnecessarily adversarial relationship between humans and the aliens.
This is where you get like a lot of the pro-American propaganda.
Yeah, and it's very silly.
It's literally like if anyone's gonna start the violence, it's China, while we're just out here really trying to figure out how
China doesn't share our egalitarian,
humanist principles.
It's like okay, guys, like really, this is ridiculous. And
right, but they even as they start to document a bit of the unrest, and while the political tensions and military tensions build up, they still like are sort of grounded in this reality that like could never be. Like they announced that there's a march on Washington. People are protesting.
They say 800,000 people have marched on Washington, it's like 800,000 people. That's like a lot of people, but it's not particularly impressive as far as
it's like the amount of people who went to like the rally to restore sanity led by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert.
Yeah.
It's like maybe like Obama's inauguration, but it's like there would be millions and millions of people,
like 15 million people march on Washington. I think that would be a little bit more impressive. And
like the government having to like fend off protests from environmentalists, because famously the concerns of the environmentalists have been so present
and so
crisis.
Influential on the actions of the government. Right. The military is pretty skeptical of our scientists' efforts at directly communicating. Initially, when they go into the heptapod, which is what we learned, they're called heptapods because they have 7 legs, right? And Amy Adams tears off her suit, and then Jeremy Renner, on seeing her do this, does the same. And the military are like, "Oh no!" Like they're kind of, there's a classic sort of army versus scientist kind of.
I mean, ultimately,
conflict.
The military characters are essentially plot points, right?
Yeah.
They're just like totally absurd obfuscation, where the tension, I think probably to deal with there's some pretty obvious third act problems, right? They need to start to like shoehorn, because they do some cool slow stuff with the language,
right?
That as a result, there's just like all he ever says over and over is like, the guys upstairs want to blow him up, you better hurry up. Like that's basically
and like the colonel is like, you're not, you're just using like kindergarten words with these guys. Like what?
Yeah.
And she's like very patient. She's like, well, I have to determine like if they understand what like to be means before we start. Like the military people are very stubborn in an almost in just completely, as you say, plot based way. They're just an obstacle.
Yeah, they're somehow smart enough to know they need to get a linguist on this ASAP, but don't spend any time thinking about what that actually apparently would mean, right?
Yeah. Another thing we see in this is that we mentioned this already. This is very pre-Trump, right? I think there's one cutaway to a kind of Rush Limbaugh-esque conspiracy type right wing.
Well, not this is the difference though, right? Not conspiracy type. His response is just militarism.
Right.
It's very much of that era. It's like the right just want to go in, regime change,
guns
the shit
blazing
out of these aliens, go in guns blazing, ask questions later or whatever. And I do think it's really interesting in terms of showing, where the thinking was at this time.
That
it is inconceivable that you could make this movie today without like a kook conspiracy character, probably also in the levels of government even. But you never hear anyone, like if it was made today, you would definitely have a sequence of events where someone is like, maybe they're not even aliens at all. Maybe the left-wing government built these to scare us and control the population, right? Like that is nowhere to be seen in this movie.
Yeah, no, it's dated in that regard, right? There's no QAnon, there's no conspiracy.
It feels quaint in that.
It feels quaint. One thing we eventually learn is this idea that she brings up is the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about the nature of language. Are you familiar with that at all?
I mean, only from the vaguest sense of watching the movie and kind of piecing together what's going on.
So it's actually pretty controversial. Like, it's not really accepted. It's also quite old, but the basic idea is that like the language that you speak and that you think in effect sort of shapes the way that you interact with and perceive the world around you, right?
Okay.
And as Amy Adams' character sort of continues to make progress in understanding, she starts to suspect that like the nature of the alien language is something that if you could
humans have yet to really conceive.
Right, that if you could fully learn the language, you might be able to start to see the world in the way that the aliens, the heptapods, see the world. And everything's going well until in one of their translation efforts, one of the words they discover, they translate as weapon.
Uh-oh.
So once there's talk of weapon, like another thing we should add
Let's go get our weapons. Let's go get our weapons.
One thing we should add is that while this collaboration has been going well with the other countries, as soon as weapon comes up, it all ends. Also, the whole time Amy Adams has been working on this, there's been a CIA minder who's there, like, to make sure that, like, geopolitical realpolitik considerations are like kept as we like engage with the aliens, right?
Yeah. The most important thing is that America retains its status as a superpower.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And the other aliens are in other countries. They're in Russia. There's one in China, of course. There's one in Sudan. It seems like the aliens have just kind of landed pell-mell across the globe. Initially, I was like, oh, is it like they're only landing in nuclear power? No, it's like Sudan. Right. Sudan is not a nuclear nation, obviously. So, and it feels like you're going to have to, like, you're going to have to work together. But this talk of weapon immediately puts an end to that. And in fact, China has decided, you know what, game over. We are, we're going to war with the aliens, right?
Right. Which again, it sort of speaks to the initial point. Everyone starts to arm up.
Yeah.
And there's no one ever who is like, wait a minute, what if they have previously unconceived ability A? What if their vessel can refract every weapon we throw at it and simultaneously destroy our entire planet?
Yeah.
And it's still just this conventional idea of scaring this entity that you have no idea about its capabilities to save you or destroy you.
Yeah, and as this is happening, a kind of rogue splinter group within the military slips a bomb into the alien viewing chamber, which explodes.
Yeah, that should do it.
But the aliens save Jeremy Renner and Amy Adams, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the aliens is killed by the bomb. And then there's this weird scene where Amy Adams kind of sneaks off and goes up by herself because the aliens sort of retreat a little bit. And she goes up by herself, and it's at this point that she finally grasps that the word is not weapon. It's could also be translated as tool, and that the tool is the language itself, right? So this sort of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was the correct way of thinking about this interaction, right? And that basically the aliens experience time differently than we do. The nature of their language allows them to experience time non-linearly, which is a complicated concept, but is one that is pretty well worn in sci-fi, right? Like,
right. But then armed with that knowledge, she also like they still are able to create a movie in which the problem is solved by the one true remaining American hero.
Well,
right?
that's true. I mean,
the chosen one.
I want to get into that in a second, but like a couple books that come to mind: Slaughterhouse-Five. By Kurt Vonnegut. Sure. Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time, right? That's a sort of governing trope. Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. The titular character, Dr. Manhattan, well, not titular, but one of the main characters, Dr. Manhattan, he has this physics accident where he's essentially dematerialized, but through some magic of comic book, he pulls himself back together and becomes able to manipulate all matter, with the consequence also that he also experiences time non-linearly. So one thing about nonlinear time is that if you can see everything you're going to do in the future, it becomes very deterministic, right?
Right.
It's like it sort of takes free will out of it. It's like, well, this is what's going to happen. And you just kind of have to go along knowing that that's going to, and that's why the aliens knew that the military was going to bomb them and that one of the two interlocutors was going to be killed.
Well, and the reason that they're there is they know that they'll need the help of the humans
in 3,000 years.
In the distant future. Yeah,
exactly. Years. So it's interesting. They, once Amy Adams' character has discerned this, she's actually able to use this ability to prevent the gift, to prevent the weapon, if you will, the tool, to prevent the Chinese from making a terrible mistake in nuking the aliens, right? And she kind of goes into the future and is at a UN banquet celebrating like 6 months since we defeated since the aliens like visited us or whatever.
Yeah.
And she's meeting with our beloved General Shang. And like this comes to what you were mentioning before. Like one of my biggest issues with this movie is that it relies on the fantasy of the genius, right?
Yep.
That Amy Adams is so smart that she figures this thing out that no one else in the whole world has figured out. All the collective action ultimately means nothing because Amy Adams, gets the key. And also she can solve the sort of geopolitical element because China is controlled by General Shang, the one great man who is like the Napoleon of China, who's just like has absolute, so that like the whole resolution of the conflict occurs because of the intersection of these two very powerful and very gifted individuals, right?
Well, it's interesting because it is like it's actually kind of fitting for the time that we exist in, but it's portrayed as a happy ending in the world we live in. It's like it's this delusion, right? On the one hand, you got the genius techno solutionists who are going to figure out, how to like make salt water drinkable in time, or all of these things that are going to save
some
us from environmental doom.
Person is going to come along and they're going to
Elon Musk, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. Well, knock on wood. Let's hope.
And then the great man, you've got like people who ascribe to like the idea that Trump is going to like figure out everything and save
and just
America
end the deep state and cause corruption and like usher in a sort of utopia, right?
Right.
Which is ridiculous.
And I think that sort of speaks to the bigger, the idea of the podcast, but also the cultural and sort of political moment as it relates to apocalyptic thinking, apocalyptic
Yeah.
culture, is that I truly think that part of the obsession with it and the proliferation of it is born of a true feeling of hopelessness of any sort of legitimate political avenue, legitimate form of dissent, any way of really reckoning with whether it's climate change or, resource scarcity, anything that is coming our way. We seem so far away from being able to handle it that descending into these sort of like meditations on it, and critiquing those,
Yeah.
right? And being critical of those is an outlet for people who I think at least some subconscious level are petrified
Yeah.
about the state of affairs and see no way, maybe outside of the delusion of the genius or the delusion of the great man, from escaping this seemingly like intractable nightmare that we're in.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is another reveal we get at the end of the film is that those flashbacks we've seen periodically throughout the movie of the sick daughter, turns out those are not flashes back, they're in fact flashes forward, right? And that what will happen is that Amy Adams will fall in love with Jeremy Renner. They will have this child who will have this terminal illness, who will pass away. Jeremy Renner will realize that she had used the alien language to know this was going to happen and went through with it anyway, and he will leave her because of that. And so there's a kind of like fatalistic aspect to the movie. There's this idea that like, I know I'm going to have this daughter who's going to die and it's going to be terrible, but I'll know that
But every moment is worth living.
yeah,
right?
that like having the daughter, even with her sort of horizons limited by illness and death, is still worth it because of the value and beauty that we get to experience together in that brief
Well,
time.
and I think the value and beauty that how in the redefinition of life with this ability to conceive of the nonlinear.
Right, because
That
if you can live every moment at once, you can essentially keep going back to that time you have with the daughter.
That's right.
So that the daughter's limited lifespan is no longer so limited if it can be infinitely revisited through the power of this language. One other thing about the movie that's very strange is, so she writes a book we see in the future
Would never happen.
about how to have this language ability yourself.
I mean, it would never happen. I mean, just think about it for one second. You have this military who stands in the way of all of this and is so concerned about.
And then they even try to bomb the aliens, right? Like,
you're telling me that now you can just go to Barnes and Noble and figure out how to escape the confines of your linear thinking pattern?
Yeah, and
no fucking chance are humans.
You're going to keep going to work after you've escaped linear thinking,
Oh my
and you're
God.
going to be a useful cog in the machine, right?
Right.
But again, this sort of tautological nature of this ability, where like there's a causation loop, right? Because she goes into the future, she gets this information from General Shang, that then back in the past she calls him in the present of that. This is all very convoluted. And repeats words to him that he has just told her in the future that convince him that the power of the heptapods is good and that they shouldn't nuke the heptapods or whatever, right? And so there's a causality loop, right? Like the past happens because of something in the future that happens in the past. It's like there's no way that doesn't make sense, like strictly logically speaking, right? But because how do you get to that future if she doesn't have the conversation that she has in the future in the past? It's just like,
Sure.
like, and I think we should talk a little bit about like, what would this world be like? Like, how many people do you think would learn to speak heptapod in the future, where they have this outside of time perceptive ability?
I mean, would you do that?
I don't know if I'd want to, right? Because
Exactly. I don't think I can't even handle linear thinking. I'm having a tough enough time with the illusion of free will. I'm not ready to fucking dance that dance. I mean, again, like I don't know. I can't even really think of how people would go about their day to day. I mean, I don't know who's working run-of-the-mill jobs. There's no sense that this is going to lead to like some social utopia.
Well, no,
They're just,
I think there sort of is it is implied that like
I don't know.
global conflict is over. They're at the ball at the UN.
Yeah,
They're meeting,
but there's still a UN. There's still a ball. There's still like this elitist classist structure.
right. Like
that
there aren't a
clearly
bunch
exists.
of they're not a bunch of homeless people at the UN ball with them. Right.
Well,
It's
there's still
yeah.
some guy like holding a boom mic so that the newscasts can carry on.
Yeah,
As though
yeah.
like now that he can conceive of the world this way, he's like, I'm gonna go put makeup on Wolf Blitzer. So that CNN can carry on. Like, you know, I mean, and another thing that I think is interesting, and maybe we will start to see in you know future episodes is speaking of it as a movie of its time, or at least a previous feeling, there still is happy ending.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like that's
quite unusual. A lot of apocalypse movies tend to end badly, strangely. I mean,
yeah, and I think that again, if you made this movie now, I'm not sure that it would be a happy ending, and maybe there would be a section where humans crumble under the weight of this new knowledge. You know, that it feels like we're moving explicitly into this realm where for something to be truly gritty and real and prestige, it almost has to be disastrous.
It has to be dark. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately it's like it's a pretty good movie. It's fun that it toys with this idea of like seeing the world through different eyes or through a different modality, right? Of like completely renovating our perception on reality.
Right, but like ultimately where it fails for me is that it does that, but cannot apply the same level of imagination to like the basic workings of humanity that would come completely apart at the seams within hours of this, you know, arrival.
Yeah, and I think like its focus on the idea of like a complete renovation of thinking is useful when you think about something like climate change. You know, like clearly like our current attitudes towards the environment, towards the world we live in, towards each other is not going to cut it for reversing this like already hundreds of years in process, like dramatic cataclysmic shift in the carbon, you know, in the atmosphere.
It's interesting to think of the idea that the movie brings up about the trappings of linear thinking, and as you apply it to the way that we approach these crises, right? Which is that like, I don't know if this was actually real or a sort of a mythical idea of politics and society, but it feels to me as I've gotten older that there has been even less genuine consideration of future generations. I mean, I know that it's always been a political tool to be like, to leave the world better.
Won't somebody think of the children, right?
Or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren.
Yeah,
that sort of like long-term thinking.
You don't hear that it doesn't get invoked as much.
Yeah, and like the prison of the present moment seems to be what we're really stuck in, and why we can't really think. You know, never mind like how ridiculous it is that a newscast would still be on when aliens arrive. Like we can't even think of a world where, as we run out of resources and water, we should, you know, stop hiding misshapen vegetables from the Whole Foods to disturb the humdrum American consumer.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I think like ultimately, like I like the idea that a radical change in perspective is what we need, that the movie kind of proposes. But I feel like ultimately the kind of whole thing hinging upon the magical genius and the all-powerful dictator, you know, meeting at the center to like snap their fingers and like result, it is ultimately not that helpful as far as thinking about actual problems in the world that we face.
And if anything, illustrative of part of our current problem. Yeah,
I think so. All right, well, I think that's pretty good. Do you have any other last thoughts on Arrival that you'd like to share?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think if I was generously, I would say that obviously I have been giving it a very hyper realist reading, and the one thing I would say to its credit is that, you know, it probably just, the movie doesn't have time to address all of the things
I mean,
that really happen.
There's a sense in the third act especially that there was other stuff in this that was cut out, because I feel like especially with the bomb plot and stuff, it just you kind of rush into that, and then we're at the end with General Shang, and so it feels like
you almost get the feeling that they're like the writers and the people making it are like look, guys, like this is already plenty smart enough. We can wrap this up.
Yeah.
We've earned it. You can see them be like, we've earned this third act where everything is so obvious and the bomb is threatened and we get the fuck out of the writer's room.
Yeah.
Because like we've already given them so much,
So much food for
play.
thought, so to speak.
Food for thought, exactly.
Yeah.
Which we hope to do in the future.
That's the
right?
dream. So what are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are moving into the more current landscape. As we
Yes.
talked about at the beginning, the movement of the apocalyptic piece into the landscape of high television, prestige television, with the very gritty, very dark The Last of Us.
Yes. Another take on the apocalypse, and one that's quite interesting. I think we'll have a lot of good stuff to talk about. So
Yeah.
be sure to subscribe, and
To the End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Stu,
And I'm Michael.
and we'll see you next time.